Hello, and welcome to our fourth CEM dialogue that will be about the principles and best practices for ecological restoration and allied restorative activities. As you know, ecosystem restoration is one of the oldest thematic areas of the Commission on Ecosystem Management. And for many years, we have been working together with the Society for Ecological Restoration, since restoration and ecological restoration practices are extremely relevant to ecosystem management. And recently, the Commission on Ecosystem Management signed an agreement with the Society for Ecological Restoration in 2019, based on the importance of collaboration to demonstrate the fundamental role that ecological restoration plays in reversing ecosystem degradation, protecting biodiversity, enhancing the delivery of ecosystem services, fostering equitable and sustainable development, and contributing to mitigating and adapting to the impacts of climate change. So some of the objectives that we have in such an agreement are increase the understanding about ecological restoration and the relationship to allied restorative activities such as rewilding, reforestation, to promote international understanding, policy development, and implementation of ecological restoration, and to improve the development and dissemination of practices, guidance, tools, and technologies for ecological restoration. This agreement is extremely important for the Commission and for IUCN, since this year we are starting the decade on ecosystem restoration, which is a very important objective that is, it will be quite relevant for all the negotiations and all the activities that will be developed during this decade. So today we will have this dialogue that was came after some discussions in the steering committee of the Commission on Ecosystem Management, and we consider that this topic was extremely important to really promote the work on ecological restoration, not just in our commission, in IUCN, but in all the organizations, members of IUCN. So today we have three speakers. We have Cara Nelson, who is leading the thematic group on ecosystem restoration in the Commission on Ecosystem Management. She is also professor of restoration ecology at the University of Montana. We have Bethany Walder, who is the executive director for the Society of Ecological Restoration. And we have Jim Hallett, chair of the Society for Ecological Restoration, who is also the vice chair of the Global Partnership for Forest Landscape Restoration, and he is affiliate professor of the University of Montana. So with this short introduction, I would like to give the floor to Bethany Walder, who will be the next speaker of today. Thank you very much for joining and for attending this session. Over to you, Bethany.
Hi, this is Cara Nelson, and before Bethany starts the formal presentation, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to CEM and to Angela and the full CEM team for inviting us to present today and having this opportunity to share perspectives with all of you, and also to thank all of you for sharing your time with us. We have two objectives during our presentation today. The first is to discuss standards of practice for ecological restoration, and specifically the international principles and standards for the practice of ecological restoration published by the Society for Ecological Restoration. And Bethany, Jim, and I will be each presenting some of the principles within these standards of practice. After that, we're going to discuss more than just ecological restoration, but all the practices along the restorative continuum. So practices allied with ecological restoration and guidance needed to meet the goals of the UN decade and maximize the potential of global initiatives in restoration. This is called a dialogue. And so we've left quite a lot of time for questions and answers after the presentation. If you could put your questions in the Q&A window rather than in the chat, then Jim will be able to find them more easily, and he'll be moderating us through that Q&A session. So thanks again to all of you for joining, and now I'll turn it over to Bethany. I'll be running the presentation, so you'll hear the presenter say next.
Thanks, Kara. And you can go to the, there we go. I was going to say you can start with the next slide. So I just want to give a brief introduction to the standards, what the process was, and why we put those together. So it really starts with looking at the role of ecological restoration in global initiatives. And I think that most of you on this call are very aware that ecological restoration does play a critical role in a wide variety of initiatives, from REDD+ to the Global Biodiversity Framework that's being developed by the CBD, to the Bond Challenge and New York Declaration, IPBES, and then of course the upcoming UN Decade on Ecosystem, or the current now UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration from 2021 to 2030. So as a result of all of these things, ecological restoration is really being scaled up. And there's also, next slide, a lot of associated targets with these. Next slide. There we go. Oh, sorry, there we go. So one of the things that's really important when we look at some of the associated targets that accompany some of these large-scale activities is that the targets themselves are really driving restorative action, but implementation is inconsistent. And prior to the development of the SER standards, there were no commonly accepted standards for restoration. It's also really important to recognize that targets and standards are not the same thing. So SER really put together these standards to create a basis upon which to measure project and program effectiveness, and also to support the development, implementation, planning, monitoring, and assessment of restoration projects. We also were looking at the issue that as these different global initiatives started to really gain traction, there's been a lot of attention, rightfully so, on climate mitigation. But climate mitigation alone does not equal ecological restoration. So how do we try to take a more holistic approach? If we focus just on one ecosystem service like carbon, you might end up with situations that drive afforestation, and there could be negative consequences for biodiversity and native ecosystems. In some instances, there's also negative societal consequences. So the standards really take an integrated approach to ecological restoration and ecosystem restoration in order to help deliver both biodiversity and ecosystem service outcomes. Next slide. One of the things we've been talking a lot about lately, and I think Kara's going to bring this up again later in the talk, is this idea of net ecological gain. And that global society, this is a quote actually from the second edition of the standards, that global society must secure a net gain in the extent and functioning of native ecosystems by investing not only in environmental protection, but also in environmental repair, including ecological restoration. But to achieve net ecological gain, we actually have to deliver both biodiversity conservation and restoration and ecosystem services. So until we are really meshing these things together, we're not going to succeed in our overall objectives. Next slide. So the goal, one of the goals for the international principles and standards is that they are applicable in all types of ecosystems. Next slide. And also that they're applicable across all sectors. Next slide. So we put together these standards. The first edition was written and published in 2016, and it was launched at the CBD COP in Cancun, Mexico in December 2016. It was really designed based on the Australian national standards that had been developed that same year, but it was adapted to incorporate many of the SER foundational documents, including a document that was one of our core documents to date, which was in partnership with IUCN and Parks Canada on the ecological restoration in protected areas for principles and guidance for that. We worked with reviewers around the world. We designed the document, the standards, the initial ones, to be a living document, and the current version as well. It had 4 authors from Australia and the US. It had been translated into about 6 languages, I think we actually just added another. And it was downloaded more than 5,000 times. Next slide. And I'm running a little behind. I apologize, Kara. So after the release of the initial standards, we went through 3 years of extensive review, hundreds and hundreds of reviewers, including through invited input, through the first SER and IUCN CEM Global Forum on Ecological Restoration, and we'll be talking about that again later, through a web-based survey, and also through published critiques in peer-reviewed journals. We identified 4 key topics for improvement in the second edition, including strengthening the discussion of cultural social elements, including traditional cultural ecosystems, clarifying and expanding the text related to restoration references and temporal change, improving the restorative continuum, and considering provenance issues for seeds and other propagules. Next slide. We launched the second edition of the standards in September 2019. It went through formal review to be published as a special issue of Restoration Ecology, and we simultaneously published a more user-friendly journal version of it as well. Next slide. It has 16 authors from 7 countries representing 5 different continents. As of January, it has been downloaded more than 20,000 times, just the English version. It is also available in Chinese, and there are 4 other translations that are nearly complete, and we hope to be releasing soon. And CEM was represented as one of the participating institutions. Next slide. The second edition of the standards made a series of upgrades from the first edition that included merging the principles and key concepts into a section of 8 principles that underpin ecological restoration. That will be the core of the remainder of this presentation from all of us. We added something called the social benefits wheel. We really discussed this issue of scaling up restoration and the relationship between restoration and allied activities. We looked at a number of key topics related to reference models. Kara's going to talk about that more in one of her sections on the principles. We added an appendix that we're not going to discuss today about sourcing of seeds and other propagules for restoration, but I encourage you to take a look at that. And a new supplement, there's a supplement on generic principles. Last slide. So this just goes through the same thing, that there's 8 principles. There is a section, which we won't talk about today, on standards of practice, and then leading practices, the glossary, and the appendices. And I'll turn it over to Jim. Thank you.
Okay, it's always the mute switch. So I'm Jim Hallett. I'm pleased to be with you all today to discuss some of the components of the SER standards document. We'll go through the principles one by one, and the first one is of particular importance. It's that ecological restoration engages stakeholders. Now, when I started in ecology, we purposely looked for systems that were not affected by people. It was a pure ecology in some kind of sense, but I've been around long enough to see the changes that have been wrought on our landscapes, and the development of conservation biology, landscape ecology, which looks at the structure and composition of habitat patches. And all of these are driven by human interactions. And so for ecological restoration to be successful, and for really any type of restorative intervention to be successful, we need to be able to consider not only the development of ecosystem integrity, but be able to address the cultural and socioeconomic and ecological values of the people that reside in the area. Next slide. So as Bethany mentioned, we've developed for this version of the standards, the social benefits wheel. This can take different forms, but I'll present you an example today where we consider six particular social attributes. Next slide, please. The first is engagement of stakeholders. And this is essential across all scales from local to regional on up to get support for activities on the ground. And so it requires that those who are interested in moving a restoration program forward identify and be able to communicate with stakeholders, and especially to incorporate their requirements for and values and perspectives as the project is planned and ultimately implemented. And ideally, the system would be at a point where it would essentially be self-managed by stakeholders. Next. Another element is the distribution of benefits to stakeholders. And where many projects fail is where equity is not ensured in terms of the opportunities provided by the restoration. This is inclusive of gender, age, and livelihoods. For example, where, for example, water resources are misdirected. Next. Third is knowledge enrichment. And this includes the identification of available information to support the restoration, and also for addressing the types of information required to determine outcomes to allow adaptive management to take place. And then to make sure that the results of whatever this particular project might be are disseminated to stakeholders and others. Next. Natural capital includes, for example, land and water management to reduce overexploitation and restore and conserve natural capital. Next. And fifth, the idea that we have economies that are sustainable over time. And so appropriate business and employment models are developed. Next. And then community well-being, which are benefits from the improved social bonding and sense of place that can be developed through people working on restoration projects. And then just public identification of the restored areas being as providing well-being, perhaps health benefits from local participation in improved ecosystem services through the restoration. Next. So the second principle is that ecological restoration draws on many types of knowledge. Next. And certainly a key source of information for getting the appropriate outcomes from restoration interventions is the experience of practitioners, people who are familiar with the local ecosystems, and how to repair soils, how to maintain native vegetation, and when and how to do that. So this information is invaluable where it's available for a project. Next. And then, of course, scientific experimentation, the ability to follow the trajectory of a particular project, determine outcomes, and make sure that if the outcome is not what is anticipated, that we understand why and modify our management practices appropriately. Next. And then traditional ecological knowledge is really knowledge about an ecosystem from the typically indigenous people that have lived in that environment for many centuries and have passed down information about the system from generation to generation. And much of this type of information is invaluable to understanding how the ecosystem has been managed over very long periods of time. And in some contexts, this includes managed burning of the environment, and in others, simply planting. Next. And then finally, local ecological knowledge. In many areas, there are not indigenous people, but there have been people living within the system for, again, centuries, and have information about how that particular system works. And for example, in Europe, the practice of coppicing trees is beginning to fade away as people who have know how to coppice trees are fading away. And so that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. I'm going to move on to principle 3. And as Bethany mentioned at the start, the idea of reference ecosystems is something that is really well developed within the 2nd edition of the standards. Principle 3 is at the heart of this, and it really is a principle that sets ecological restoration, the highest aspirational restorative activity you can do on the landscape. This principle really sets ecological restoration apart from other types of restorative activities. And the principle is, ecological restoration practice is informed by native reference ecosystems while considering environmental change. And why this concept is so well developed in the 2nd edition of the standards is because there has been a lot of confusion about the reference ecosystem. What is the reference for ecological restoration? The word restoration has "re" in it, and so it has been misconstrued and misunderstood as moving back in time, holding ecosystems stable at some prior point in time. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth in terms of the goals of ecological restoration. So I'm going to run through a slide deck to emphasize that point. And the first place I want to start is that these references for ecological restoration have to be consistent with inherent properties of ecosystems. And one inherent property of all ecosystems is that they change. And I've put a photograph here to get you thinking about temporal change. And of course, we see changes at decadal scale, century scales, and then at millennial scales. But ecological change is a property of all ecosystems, not because of people and anthropogenic factors, causing climate change, which we think about in this era of rapid change that we're in. But actually, change is a natural part of all ecosystems. And we know this from the pollen record, as well as other sources. And in fact, a major focus of ecology has been studying change. And I want to show you a pollen record from Western Washington in the United States. And what's cool is you can take sediments from lake cores, and these sediments can go back even 20,000 years. And by looking at the abundance of pollen in different levels of the sediment cores, you can see this ecological change in the dynamic nature of ecosystems. And so here's just a little bit of data. And on this chart, the x-axis is pollen percentages in sediment cores. This is from Brubaker et al., again from Washington State. And so you see the different pollen percentages, pines and spruce, the names of the species are listed across the top, the taxa. And then on the y-axis is years before present. And so as the glaciers were receding in this area, we saw pine And then as it got warmer, the pine dropped off, and you see, not where my circle is, but to the right of the chart, alder, grasses, and pteridium, fern. And that's because we had a lot of fire as the climate warmed. And then finally, in the hypsothermal, 6,000 years ago, the development of our modern flora of thuya as a dominant tree. That's the common name red cedar. So, why am I showing these pollen percentages, right? Well, it's really to get you thinking about what temporal change, this inherent property of all ecosystems, what it means for references for ecological restoration. And what it means is that this model that I'm showing you right now is not the model we're after. Ecological restoration does not aim to return systems to previous points in time. So here I've got the green bubble is the biophysical envelope of an intact ecosystem at some point in the past. The brown is the degraded site now. That gray arrow bringing it back to some former state is not the goal of restoration. Instead, we're aiming to reestablish ecological trajectories, and that requires developing a reference model. So the objective of restoration, to summarize what I've just said, is to move the ecosystem to the condition it would have been in now if it hadn't been degraded, not the past ecosystem. And what the reference is a model of that condition, the condition it would have been in now if it hadn't been degraded. It's complicated to build a reference model. Best case scenario is you have modern analogs or reference sites. These would be sites that are similar to your project area, except they haven't been degraded or they've been minimally degraded. Of course, there's some issues or pitfalls with this approach. One of them is you can't use a single site, and this is because no two ecosystems are the same. So if you want to understand the mean conditions, right, you need to have data from multiple reference sites in your model. Now, of course, I'm sure some of you are thinking, wow, that is really challenging because I don't know for my system if I could find even a single reference site, no less a statistically valid number I might need to create a model that represents the mean. And where that's the case, there's other types of information that can be brought in, like historic information, if available. If using historic information, it's important to think about sort of the temporal error. So with modern analogs, there's some spatial error. No two ecosystems are alike. With historic information, you need to think about how much temporal change might have occurred in the system and sort of interpolate from the past to the present. And then, of course, other forms of knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, successional models, other ecological models. All of this needs to be brought to bear to do the best job you can. And that's going to vary by project and geographic location to identify the condition your project area, the ecosystem of interest, would have been in if degradation hadn't occurred. Okay, so hopefully I've hit that point well, the importance of the reference model and making sure that it accounts for temporal change. Very quickly, I have one other point and one slide for it, which is accounting for ecosystem complexity, which is also critical in the reference model, right? You don't want to just have a narrow set of variables that you look at in your reference system. And so I'll direct you to the standards which outline the key attributes that you should be looking at for developing your reference model, including physical conditions, species composition, structural diversity, ecosystem function, and importantly, external exchanges, subsidies that flow across ecosystems. I'm going to move on to principle 4, which is ecological restoration supports ecosystem recovery processes. So the aim of ecological restoration is to assist natural processes of recovery that are then carried out by the effects of time and biota and interactions among biota. And of course, the most reliable and most cost-effective way to accomplish restoration is through natural regeneration, right? To harness the potential for natural regeneration. But of course, many degraded ecosystems have crossed thresholds where natural regeneration is not possible. And this is a well-loved figure, not from the standards, but from one of the documents that Bethany mentioned, Principles and Guidelines for Ecological Restoration in Canada's Protected Natural Areas. And this figure is adapted from an original one by Steve Wismont. And what it shows is different levels of degradation and how that affects what you need to do at a site. And so I'm going to start over here on the right-hand side, and where your system has not crossed biotic barriers, meaning that there's organisms, seeds, plants, clonal fragments of plants, wildlife available. You may just need to improve management and allow natural regeneration to occur. Once you've crossed the biotic barrier here in the middle, biological modification needs to happen. You need to bring in biota. And then there's this abiotic barrier here on the left, where you really need to get into reassembling or impacting the physical condition of the site in order to allow restoration to occur. But importantly, restoration is about getting these natural processes going. And I'll end principle 4 by saying that what this all means is that there needs to be a clear assessment at the beginning of projects before designing the interventions to determine the potential for natural regeneration and other passive means of restoration, and also the need to actively reinstate missing biotic and abiotic elements. And I'll turn it over to Bethany for principle 5.
Thanks, Kara. So principle 5 is that flows exactly from what Kara was just saying, that ecological restoration is assessed against clear goals and objectives using measurable indicators. So it includes these 6 components. It spends a bit of time looking at how you identify scope, vision, targets, goals, and objectives, and then making sure that you're including ecological and social attributes of the project during planning, conducting the baseline inventory, using indicators to monitor progress over time, applying adaptive management, and then monitoring comes up both in that question of indicators, in the question of adaptive management, and then also in the context of funding, so that you have the monitoring, you're planning for monitoring right from the beginning stages. Next slide. I'm just going to go through a couple pieces of Principle 5 briefly. So I think everybody on this call knows what a baseline inventory is. It relates to what Kara just discussed, and we define it here as an assessment of the current biotic and abiotic elements of a site prior to ecological restoration, including composition, structure, and function. The baseline inventory is important for helping inform your targets, goals, and objectives, for providing a comparison for detecting change over time, and for identifying, as Kara said, the reference model and the analysis of the degree of recovery required. So we have this little arrow that basically starts with that conducting your baseline inventory, using that to feed into your reference ecosystem, then developing your plan, then collecting data, including through project monitoring. Next slide. One of the other things that I also want to just follow up on from what Kara was talking about regarding the reference ecosystem is the relationship between the reference ecosystem and the target. The model that you develop should describe the native ecosystem as if full recovery is the target. But in many instances, we don't have the luxury to go all the way to full recovery. Where we do, and where full recovery is possible and desirable, then your ecological target is going to align very well with your reference model. But in projects that aim only for partial recovery, and in many instances, that is your only viable option, your target and your reference model may not fully align. So you might have a situation where your target ecosystem might actually lack some species or include some non-native surrogates, or the ecological targets might be modified to address social targets. And so it's important to recognize that you can uncouple the reference ecosystem from your targets. Next slide. So monitoring is essential from an adaptive management perspective, but also, I'm sorry, my little timer went off. Monitoring is also important for generating social learning, for answering specific questions, for applying adaptive management, and for providing evidence to stakeholders. And that evidence might include visual evidence or formal quantitative monitoring. But when we talk about that evidence, it's also important from a communication perspective. So how do we communicate with the public, with decision makers? And we can't do that without monitoring data. We also can't improve our restoration projects without monitoring data that enables us to do adaptive management. Next slide. So that's what I'm going to spend more time on talking about with Principle 6, which is that ecological restoration seeks the highest level of recovery possible. So restoration aims for the highest practical level appropriate to the circumstances. If you're doing restoration in an urban setting or in a rural setting, you're going to be able to accomplish certain things. Whereas if you're doing restoration in a wildland setting, you can accomplish other things. So SER has developed something we call the Ecological Recovery Wheel, and it uses what we call the 5-star recovery scale to help make those assessments. But it's important to recognize also that recovery does not always happen directly in conjunction with the restoration activities you take. Ecosystems take time to recover, and we should be adopting a policy of continuous improvement informed by sound management. Next slide. So SER has developed this 5-star scale, and I'll show some more things about that in a minute, but basically each of the attributes, Kara showed the 6 attributes, and each of those has sub-attributes. And each of those sub-attributes has can be measured on this 5-star scale. And so one attribute might be at 1 star and another attribute might be at 4 stars in your baseline. And so that scale and those sub-attributes can all be measured, appropriately. In addition, as we talk about the 5-star scale and the recovery wheel, one of the most important things that we want to make clear is that that scale is not intended to imply project value. All projects should aim for what is possible at that site. If 2-star recovery is what's possible, then 2-star recovery is a wonderful, fabulous thing. And 5-star recovery probably wouldn't be because it's not possible. So you want to set your objectives, set your recovery wheel according to what you can accomplish. Next slide. So this is just, I'm not going to go through this slide. Kara talked about the 6 attributes. In the standards, we have a table that goes through samples of 1 to 5-star recovery under each of the 6 attributes. We're making amendments to that table right now, and we'll be releasing those soon as just a part of this living document, and that we're constantly learning and improving it. Next slide. What I really want to focus on for my last few slides is the ecological recovery wheel. So this takes those 6 attributes, and it has in this example, in the example we include in the standards, it includes 3 sub-attributes for each of the 6 attributes. But the ecological recovery wheel is malleable. You can change it. It's your wheel to use as you see fit. Our hope is that you would keep the 6 key attributes, but that you would adapt the sub-attributes as needed. In this picture, you see an example of, this is a hypothetical example that would basically be kind of something aiming for 4-star recovery, but it's maybe more at the baseline. Next slide. So I'm going to walk through just 3 or 4 case studies of how the wheel has been used. In this example from New South Wales, Australia, obviously the wheel has only been out for 4 years, but they had their baseline data and the before data. So they took the recovery wheel, they made an assessment of each of those 18 sub-attributes for the baseline, and then they made a second recovery wheel for showing recovery 10 years later and showing that this is really a 4-star project. We've gotten to 4 stars on the majority, and that this recovery wheel is kind of set for that. Next slide. So this slide shows a completely different way that the recovery wheel has been used. This was implemented in the UK, where somebody identified 6 river restoration projects that were completed and then control sites as well. They took the sub-attributes and they identified the exact things they wanted to measure, what they were going to survey. They actually designed this so that all of these surveys could be done in one day in the field for each of the different river sites. So it was added, 8 to 10 hours of field work and very little cost. So how do we do this in a cost-effective manner? And then instead of doing a before and after, they took it and they used red, yellow, and green to show where certain sub-attributes degraded as a result of the restoration project and where those sub-attributes stayed neutral and where they improved. And I think this is also really important to talk about that visual presentation because it shows that restoration doesn't always accomplish what we want to accomplish. And we want to be transparent about that so that we can effectively adapt and manage and improve our restoration outcomes. Next slide. This slide comes from the bottom of the slide is cut off on my screen, but it's marine ecosystem restoration in European seas, something like that. And I apologize if anybody is here from MERSIS and I just butchered your acronym, but it was included in the slide that I can't see right now. But what the folks there did also was this same green, yellow, and red dashboarding, as we call it. And they also added additional sub-attributes and they've added an additional wedge looking at ecosystem services. This was done before we released our new social benefits wheel. But again, it shows how you can adapt and use this wheel the way you want. And then the last example I have is from partners in Mexico, specifically from Instituto Nacional de Pesca y Acuicultura, or INAPESCA. And this was a wheel that Claudia Padilla put together to assess coral reef restoration. And if you go to the next slide, you can see how she kind of used this. And she's got three different stages of assessment that she used here, but she modified the sub-attributes to assess what she needed to assess with coral reef restoration. So the bottom line is the recovery wheel is malleable, adaptable, and enables us to get a sense, going back to my very first slides, of are we looking at a holistic scope of restoration benefits, or are we only benefiting a few things, as you can kind of see at the baseline condition of that first slide on the left. And I'll stop there and pass it on to Jim.
Great, thank you, Bethany. So we're now at Principle 7, one more after that. And Principle 7 addresses the issue of restoration at large scales. And it argues that cumulative value is gained when we can apply ecological restoration at large scales. Now, this does not suggest that smaller ecological restoration projects do not have benefit, because they surely do. But it brings up an issue, next please, of what happens as we try to scale up restoration projects. And it works both ways, because we should gain much increased value by scaling up. And in fact, the international initiatives for restoration ask us to do that. But at the same point, as we move to the landscape scale, there's increased complexity involved ecologically, and the potential for greater cumulative damage at the landscape scale. And so I want to consider just 3 possible situations. One is landscape pattern, where landscapes can become fragmented over time. And as fragments are created, these affect other physical processes that can be affect what's happening within that region. And consequently, a small scale project that addresses one fragment may ultimately fail because of continued destruction elsewhere. So a landscape context for restoration is important. Indirectly, we can think about the restoration of physical processes that are going to affect other systems. These could include linkages between primary and secondary productivity. But we can think also in terms of secondary effects from, say, road building, which could lead to greater conversion of habitats. In some cases also we have cross-boundary situations where our restoration is going to influence the condition or processes outside of the restored sites. And these could include interactions between restored sites as well. And so the effects occur away from the source. Next slide, please. When we consider scale, it's also true for conservation of species that requirements of many species may not be met by a small scale project unless it can be linked within a larger program or to other protected areas. For example, this is the Atlantic forest in Brazil, where jaguars were relatively common. Now, if there are habitat fragments that are under 100 kilometers, most of the jaguars have disappeared. Same is true between 100 and 1,000 square kilometers. And only 40% of the habitat fragments that are greater than 1,000 kilometers, still have jaguars. So there's a scale issue that will require consideration if we're to maintain top predators within these systems. Next, please. We can only, in terms of also addressing climate change and carbon sequestration, is required to increase carbon fixation through vegetation and other biomass. This is a schematic for a work that is started in Peru to give you an indication of how restoration on the landscape can provide, and at a large scale, can maintain and protect many species that are at risk, produce carbon credits, and also produce livelihoods for those outside of the protected area. And so this is an issue really of scale. Next, please. So we have to think about ecological restoration at the scales that are needed to provide environmental and ecological benefits, also realizing that the factors that are disturbing these systems can be outside of a small project area. Next, please. So Principle 8 is, I think, one of the key ones in the standards, and that is that restoration is part of a continuum of restorative activities. And so there are many things that we can do that can improve ecosystems, provide ecosystem services, and reduce degradation to, as Bethany mentioned earlier, result in partial or full recovery of ecosystems. Next. And here is a schematic of how one might view a continuum of restorative interventions. So beginning on the left side of the slide, simply reducing societal impacts. This could be in terms of packaging, food use, and the like, to improvements in ecosystem management, and then ultimately moving into situations where we begin the repair of the ecosystem process. So in other words, reducing negative impacts on the system, and moving then to repairing ecosystem function by also reducing disturbance and beginning actively to work towards that goal. Then to initiating recovery of native species, to partial recovery, and then on to full recovery of native ecosystems. And so it's a range of activities that can reduce negative impacts to fully recovering native ecosystems. And Kara will pick up this in a few minutes. I think that's it from my part. Thank you, Kara.
Thanks, Jim. So we just went through 8 principles in the standards for ecological restoration, and this document has been tremendous for communicating a shared vision for ecological restoration. And as Bethany mentioned at the beginning, it has a large number of authors from around the globe with over 3 years of consultation. So it's amazing guidance for ecological restoration. I want to shift now to the second objective for today, which is guidance needed for allied restorative activities. And the reason I'm talking about this is because, of course, in global initiatives and the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, we're not just talking narrowly about ecological restoration. In fact, we're talking about all of those activities that Jim presented on the continuum, the restorative continuum. And I think one of the real contributions of the standards, in fact, is this image of the restorative continuum and clearly defining the space of ecological restoration on the continuum. And again, per the principles, that goal of returning the system to the condition it would have been in now if it hadn't been damaged, degraded, or destroyed, sets this highest aspirational idea of ecological restoration apart from the other activities on the continuum, keeping in mind that there can be full or partial recovery. And you can see that here in this chart in the 3 different shades of green. But one key need moving forward to really optimize what we can do in the decade of ecosystem restoration and the power of these global initiatives is to have guidance across the restorative continuum. And specifically, what does it mean across all these different activities to have net gain in both ecological integrity and human well-being? So within the standards, that's well defined again for ecological restoration. But how do we define net gain and minimum net gain for these other allied restorative activities? And the heart of that challenge is saying, what constitutes a restorative activity along the continuum? The second key need is to optimize where ecological restoration is deployed. And within restoration initiatives, we talk so much about prioritization, and it's amazing that now we have national plans and regional plans for restoration that have included really solid methods for prioritizing where restorative intervention should occur. I've showed a map here from Colombia with one of these types of assessments. But most of these assessments are being done thinking again about restorative activities, priorities for restorative activities. Within that, it's important to think through where ecological restoration might best be deployed. One great tool for thinking through this is the red list of ecosystems, because of course that identifies level of risk to ecosystems and risk of collapse. I have another slide I want to show that I hope will highlight the importance of this issue. So I've just chosen FLR, but you could put it with your favorite restorative activity in the blue bubble. And of course, some restorative activities will be ecological restoration. If we don't specifically prioritize ecological restoration as the activity we want to do in portions of the landscape, we don't give adequate attention to that, we may see only a small amount of ecological restoration being done. However, if we really focus on prioritizing where on the landscape we want to deploy ecological restoration, that highest aspirational approach to recovery, we may get what I've shown here in my schematic B of more overlap of ecological restoration within these initiatives. And I have one more key need for guidance to meet the challenges of the upcoming decade, and that's developing common principles and standards of practice. And I might not have articulated this quite right, but we have a proliferation of principles and standards within forest landscape restoration. We've just presented the framework for ecological restoration. And of course, there's the newly released principles and standards for nature-based solutions. So how can we leverage all of these frameworks to identify best practices across disciplines and across scales? Angela started by mentioning that there's been this long history of collaboration among CEM or between CEM and the Society for Ecological Restoration. We have been collaborating now for 6 years on delivering expert forums on ecological restoration. Bethany mentioned our first forum was a chance for experts to weigh in and share perspectives on the development of the international principles and standards. Our next forum has the objective to develop guidance to improve biodiversity and human well-being outcomes from restorative activities, moving beyond just ecological restoration. And we have 3 themes that we'll be discussing, and they basically one each for the key needs that I just presented. Defining net game, prioritizing ecological restoration within restorative interventions, and developing common principles and standards of practice across scales and disciplines. So that's what's coming next in terms of our collaboration. And what's next for our presentation today is to thank you for participating. We really are so pleased that many of you were able to join us today, and we're hoping that you'll share your questions and comments in the Q&A window. Jim is going to moderate us. I've included everyone's email at the bottom of the slide here, so you can be in touch with any of us for further dialogue and exchange. And I'll turn it over to Jim.
Okay, thank you, Kara. Let me see if I can get my video back. Hello. Kara, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Jim.
Okay, my video seems to have frozen up, but you'll just have to have actually my whole computer seems to have frozen up at the moment. Here we go. So there are a number of questions. Mike Jones, who I have not seen in many years, has been very active in the Q&A window. Mike is asking several questions. I'm going to begin with his first, which is, what is a native ecosystems? Ecosystems have been modifying ecosystems since Homo erectus learned how to make fire about 1.4 million years ago. Humans inhabit most all parts of planet Earth, and the activities of industrial societies has affected every part of the planet, except perhaps the deep oceans, and that is soon to change. Kara, do you want to address that one?
Sure, absolutely. And I'll also direct those of you who are interested in this topic to the standards, because we have an in-depth discussion in there about cultural ecosystems. And so this concept of the native ecosystem does not exclude people. It includes the effect that cultures have had on landscapes. Instead, how we've defined a native ecosystem is an ecosystem that has not been degraded, damaged, or destroyed through human modifications. So hopefully that clarifies that.
Great.
Yeah, if I could add to that, the standards have a glossary, and I can just actually read the full definition of native ecosystem from the glossary, which is an ecosystem comprising organisms that are known to have evolved locally or have recently migrated from neighboring localities due to changing environmental conditions, including climate change, in certain circumstances. Traditional cultural ecosystems or semi-natural ecosystems are considered to be native ecosystems. The presence of non-native species or the expansion of ruderal species in native ecosystems are forms of degradation.
Thanks, Bethany.
Okay, I'll move to Charlie Shore presented a question. So Kara presented a bullet point that said we're looking holistically at ecosystems with little emphasis on social or human aspects. Then James came on with his social benefits wheel. Recognizing that stakeholder input is critical to success, I think that an overemphasis on the human element would detract from the more holistic approach. That's an interesting comment, Charlie. I don't know that we've reached that stage of overemphasis yet. I think the restorative continuum addresses that in part in terms of the work that needs to be done. What I have seen on the ground is that where we don't bring the human element in, projects can fail, and not only fail, but turn upside down with further environmental degradation. Kara, Bethany, do you want to comment?
Yes, I'm dying to jump in here. Thanks, Jim, because this is such an important point, and it speaks to this using models that include both temporal change. I spent a ton of time on that, but I didn't spend a lot of time on ecological complexity, which is another inherent attribute of ecosystems. And I realize I'm starting a little bit away from the question, but I'm going to come back there to Charlie's question. So we mentioned the attributes and the long list of attributes that need to be considered. And what that means is that the focus for the ecological goals of restoration are on those ecological attributes. And that's important. It shouldn't be about the nature's contribution to people or goods and services you get from the landscape. The focus in design is the restoration of these ecological attributes, with the idea that if we want these services over the long term, that we need to have this focus on ecological complexity and integrity. However, another important principle of restoration is this stakeholder engagement and human well-being benefits. And that is critical, because if you don't have those elements, and I'm reiterating what Jim said, if people don't care about these projects, restoration interventions may be lost. So we spend a lot of money to do some activities only to have later management add degradation, and we lose our investment. And so the two really go together. Hopefully I've clarified kind of where the focus on ecosystems and ecosystems needs fits within the scheme.
I think that was great, Kara. And I think Jim got kicked off the call somehow. So I don't see you here, Jim. Are you still here? Okay, assuming not, I'm going to go to the next question, which I think, or one of the next questions. I think that the discussion that just happened regarding the ecological recovery wheel and the social benefits wheel is reiterated in one or two questions later, and so we might be able to skip those. But one of the questions that I know you also wanted to talk about, Kara, was from Somnath Roy, which is, how is the degree of recovery calculated?
Okay, great. Thanks so much for that question. When we were preparing for this presentation, I wanted to include some slides showing that this recovery wheel concept is really a foundational concept within the field of restoration ecology. And so one of the ways that restoration success has been measured, and there's several amazing papers that highlight this, including one by David Mateo Morenas on wetland restoration. Maybe some of you have seen this because it includes 600 wetland restoration projects. And the approach used, it's jargony, a response ratio. What that response ratio is comparing project sites after treatment to reference sites. And that, in fact, is the basis of the recovery wheel. So the recovery wheel, the outside, is 100% of the condition of your reference site. And then as you move through the different radii, it's different percentage accomplishment relative to the reference site, putting aside for the moment that the target might not be 100% recovery. And so in fact, one of the ways this could be operationalized for monitoring is that the 5 stars could be considered simply as percentage of reference achieved. And that's the response ratio concept. Hopefully that wasn't too jargony. Bethany, do you want to add something there?
No, I think that that is a great example. And I think that people are using, I mean, I think people are applying that in different ways, but again, coming back to this idea that the recovery wheel is for you to use and for you to determine. And so even in that concept of response ratios, you might decide that 3 stars for one thing might be a certain response ratio, but 4 stars for a different sub-attribute might have the same. So your response ratio, you would determine what the response ratios are for those different levels for each individual sub-attribute. You would determine if you're measuring a different thing for that attribute. So it's there's a lot of flexibility, but I think also a lot of opportunity for commonality. And I would even also come back to what Charlie asked, because if you use both the ecological recovery wheel and the social benefits wheel, then you can use the ecological recovery wheel to show that holistic approach to ecological restoration on the ecological side. And you can use the social benefits wheel to discuss how are we addressing traditional ecological knowledge and how are we addressing stakeholder engagement and these other things. And I think in the process of developing the second edition of the standards, we also discussed adding 1 or 2 wedges to the ecological recovery wheel, and we decided that was not the best approach, and we wanted to keep the ecological in one place and put the other components in another place so that you could have both wheels together for an individual project. And maybe that is answering 2 questions at one time, but anyway.
The point being that the recovery wheel is flexible. If you're doing a data-driven quantitative exercise, there's ways to utilize the wheel using these response ratios. And what Bethany pointed out is that we don't need to have linear relationships with each of those variables. This is something I'm really interested in discussing. And so if anyone wants to contact me, I'd be happy to have a sidebar conversation and share perspectives on this concept of the recovery wheel.
And I see Jim is back. We've covered a couple more questions, Jim. I'm going to keep going. The next one I'll put out is the question from Madhav Karki, which is, what is the difference between no net biodiversity loss and no net ecosystem loss? Are these conceptually the same, or is one broader than the other? And I don't know if Kara or Jim wants to answer that. And I would also just throw in at the beginning that and I'll put that to one of the 2 of you to answer, but one of the things that we're really focusing on is not no net loss, but moving to net ecological and biodiversity gain. And the reason that we're focusing on that is because the planet is unraveling at no net loss right now. If we just went to no net loss, we're still going to keep unraveling. It would be a huge accomplishment to get to no net loss. We need to get there first to get to neutral. But then we need to move to gain to start that healing process. So I don't know, Kara or Jim, do either one of you want to take on this question of no net biodiversity versus no net ecosystem loss? Kara, you're nodding your head, so I'll let you go.
Sure. So I suspect that we could have a really rich conversation about this topic. My view is that no net ecosystem loss would be a component of no net biodiversity loss, because of course biodiversity scales from genes to landscapes. And so ecosystems would be one level or component within overall biodiversity.
Great. Jim, anything you want to add?
No, I think that covers it really. You know, I don't know many people thinking about no net ecosystem loss, actually. You know, that they're kind of bound together, as Kara mentioned.
Okay.
And if I could add one more thing at the risk of speaking too much here, but I think this concept of biodiversity loss is really important, and it's hard because of the complexity. And so we tend to reduce it to the most easily measured variables within a system. So for instance, we talk about biodiversity often, but we really just mean species richness. And so another key need is to figure out how we can really have indicators and criteria for biodiversity, recognizing all the levels of the hierarchy: ecosystem, species, populations, genes, landscapes, seascapes.
Okay. So we do have a couple of people who've asked a number of questions. I'm going to take one more from Madhav. I'm going to direct this one to Jim and then Kara. In one of the slides presented, someone said that both ecosystem structure and function, they're both key attributes, are important when ecological restoration happens. But in the restorative continuum, ecosystem structure is not mentioned. Is it implicit? Can you clarify? Jim, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. So it would be, I mean, really implicit, because I mean, the end game for ecological restoration is restoring both ecosystem structure and function, and so that would be implied by those activities. Now, on the far left, where we're beginning simply to reduce social impacts on the environment and ecological systems, then in that case we may be not be restoring function, but reducing further damage to the structure and function of the ecosystem.
Thank you. Kara, you good with that?
Well, quickly to add on, I think on that left side of the continuum, reducing societal impacts, remediation, rehabilitation. On the left side, we may see projects that just focus on composition or structure or function. And when we get all the way over to that highest aspirational ecological restoration, then all of those attributes that Bethany and I spoke about would need to be included. And that does include composition, function, structure, all of that.
Okay.
So
Great.
it's kind of all in there.
So here's another question. This is from Grace Rakid. I apologize for anybody's name that I'm saying wrong, which is most of you. Given the complexity and uncertainty associated with ecosystem restoration, what is your take on the discussion about ecosystem restoration in offsetting projects? Who would like to jump at that one first?
It's a
Jim?
great question.
Yeah. Do you want to take a first crack? I could take a crack. I'm happy to if you guys want me to start, but give you the option first.
Go, Bethany.
Well, I would come back. I think that I would say a couple of things in response to this question. Maybe this is answering it or maybe it isn't. I think one of the things that SER says right up front in the opening introduction of the standards, and that we say in many, many different things, is that ecological restoration should never be used as a justification for further degradation. And so I think this is a similar issue with nature-based solutions, with other things, that because we have the ability to do some healing doesn't mean that we can do more degradation. And I think this gets further to this concept of wanting to move to net gain. And so offsetting is something that happens because degradation is happening. So we want to make sure that, so I think that ecosystem restoration is appropriate in offsetting personally. I think it's appropriate in offsetting projects. In the United States, for example, we see huge investment. There's an entire economic sector related to mitigation banking. And we see enormous amounts of constructed wetlands associated with mitigation banking and wetland restoration. And it's really good and amazing work. And that work provides all sorts of extraordinary benefits, and it's restorative and it's restoration. But how do we get to net gain? And so we need to make sure that we are investing in restoration in a manner that gets us to net gain. And if we only look at ecosystem restoration in the context of offsets, then the closest we're going to get is net neutrality, which is what not net neutrality, internet neutrality, but to net ecological neutrality. And that's not enough. We know that's not enough right now because the systems are unraveling. And so it should be included, but we need to understand how to include it maybe at a 3 times or 5 times to 1 level. That also creates problems. Like I was just reading about a situation in California where there's such a demand for land offsets with development that people are now buying land just to sell it at high, like they're buying intact land so that they can sell it to the people who have to buy offsets. And so you create a new perverse incentive that's increasing the cost and preventing that money from being spent on other restorative activities. So that's a long answer. Maybe Kara or Jim want to add.
I have one small point to make, which is Bethany talked about maybe not getting to net gain, but I also want to point out that there's been real concern that restoration specifically for carbon as a primary goal may actually have some adverse consequences for biodiversity. And we've heard a lot about that in the literature and in different forums. And so again, that's that point of recognizing ecological complexity and starting with the ecological goals in project design rather than focusing on just one narrow ecosystem service.
And recognizing that restoration, even though we can do an extraordinary amount, we aren't, what we can do, it might still take decades or centuries for nature to get back to a fully comprehensively functioning place. And so it's, we can make things look good, we can make things function, we can have good structure, we can have good services. It doesn't mean it's the same as an undegraded, intact system. And we should not, when we can compare them, that's fine, but it's not the same thing. Go ahead. And then we'll move on to another question, but yeah.
Move on, but I do think that the carbon market could be an important way to fund restoration activities, and that, you know, could also have great social benefits in employing local people and developing local technologies. And also in going directly back to the question, there's a real need to monitor the actual carbon benefits from doing these activities over time.
Great, thanks. Mike Jones had another question, basically saying that he prefaces it with a little bit of promotion here, but that SES scientists have now produced 2 comprehensive guidelines with various tools for ecosystem assessment. To what extent are these known and used by restoration practitioners? Without naming them, I have no idea, but maybe Jim or Kara knows about some of these other tools. And if not, I would encourage you, Mike, to put links to those in the chat so that everybody can see what those tools are and that we would have the opportunity to apply them in this work. But Kara or Jim, are you aware of those?
Well, I'm aware of ecosystem assessment tools. I'm not sure I know these ones specifically. I'm sure Mike can inform us.
Okay, so maybe put something in the chat there. There's a question from Pascal Leonide asking about kind of that interaction between starting an ecological restoration project with or without the involvement of the state or of government. And I would say there are a lot of projects that move forward without government. There are projects on industrial, for example, large industrial landholders often do restoration. There are also a lot of small holders doing restoration. There are different incentives in different countries for restoration. In Brazil, for example, you have the forest code that requires a certain percentage of land to be restored and protected, and that gets to this very high level of smallholder restoration engagement. And there are other things, there are farm bill incentives in the United States that promote restoration. From a funding perspective, I think the state tends to play a very important role from the finance perspective, but there are many, many, many opportunities for restoration to occur without state engagement. Kara or Jim, do you want to add anything to that question?
Well, I mean, that is true. I mean, a lot of projects that have been developed are community-based projects. In the Northwest US where I am, there are groups working on stream restoration, and they're building artificial beaver dams to do that. And so there's no state involvement at all, really. And so it will just depend on the particular region as to what the state's intervention might be.
Great, thanks. It looks like we have a new question from Dr. Aijaz Ahmad Qureshi, asking for some more information about how restoration, ecology, and ecosystem functioning are being taken at the policy level in terms of overall biodiversity conservations, and how we can better highlight restoration as an important tool for conservation, especially in developing countries. And then there are a number of questions asking about if the slides will be available, et cetera. So we'll answer those right before the end. But Kara, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I think there's really two parts of that question. So I'll address the first part, which is ecosystem functioning and getting ideas of functioning into restoration policy. And I think there's a lot of activity surrounding that right now. And I think the standards and this shared vision that they represent is an effort to do just that. So the standards were written not just for restoration scientists, not just for restoration practitioners, but also for people involved in restoration policy. And there's a short version that goes along with them, highlighting some of the key issues. The different global initiatives, for instance, the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity is right now struggling with developing indicators and criteria for the post-2020 biodiversity targets. And there's an emphasis on function within those criteria and indicators, or at least in the development of them to date. So I think this is front and center of what we need to do as ecologists in terms of engaging in the dialogue and enforcing to policymakers that we need to embrace ecological complexity moving forward. If we don't do so, 100 years from now, our kids' may be forced with repairing the degradation that occurred from the management activities that we're doing now, right? And so function is at the heart of that. The second part of the question was about how to have people adopt sort of capacity for restoration. Maybe Jim wants to answer that. Can you repeat the second part, Bethany?
The second part is how it can be highlighted by researchers as an important tool for conservation, especially in developing countries, and how we can coordinate together, people from CEM, on some of these long-term goals. So yeah, Jim, do you want to? And then there's one more question I want to make sure we get to before we kind of close this out. So let's try to finish this one.
Very short. I think it's imperative that scientists, restoration ecologists working in applied ecology go beyond publishing their work and instead innovate science into prescriptions for practice. I'll turn it to you, Jim.
Yeah, good point. So if I understand the question properly, it's how to integrate ecological restoration into conservation at the community level. Is that the?
And I think writ large into overall biodiversity conservation.
Yeah, well, so this is actually an important point, and as chair of SER, I've been in communication now with the chair of or president of the Society for Conservation Biology, and so there are clear linkages between our objectives for improving ecosystem functioning and structure, and the goals of maintaining biodiversity. They're totally interlinked, but we have taken somewhat different paths in addressing those issues. And we're at a point now where, I gave an illustration of the broader types of restoration activities that are taking place in Peru around a national park. And it's where conservation meets restoration, really, and brings in the social fabric. And so that requires a lot of capacity building and stakeholder engagement to make that kind of project successful. And in many cases, these have moved forward through non-government organizations that have the desire to assist people and the environment together, because they are so totally interlinked. So the other issue that I see is just in terms of overall capacity development at the local level to not only initiate restoration projects, but to ensure their continuity over the long term. And this is an issue that the CBD has been concerned with, and it's shown particularly through the restoration targets that the CBD had for 2011 to 2020, and it's required a great deal of capacity building, a lot of encouragement at both the national and regional levels to get restoration moving forward. And so we still have a lot of communication to do to get this to work.
So the last question that I think we have time for is one that's raised by Mohammed Talib. And he asks about comments about the experience of Indigenous people in local communities, as well as sacred sites, which can be successful and strongly support the ecological restoration of ecosystems. And I just want to say 100% agreed. I think it's one of the reasons that we emphasize TEK and local ecological knowledge as well in the standards. SER has just reestablished a traditional and local ecological knowledge committee of our Science and Policy Committee, and we're going to have a lot of speakers and several symposia on this topic at our SER 2021 all virtual conference in June, which I encourage people to consider. I think that Jim really talked about this role of Indigenous people in local communities in the beginning in Principles 1 and 2, and I think that it's SER, and I think both CEM as well see this as just imperative to the success of restoration and also to learning from that traditional knowledge and applying that in more restoration projects. There's an incredible opportunity for partnership and collaboration, and it's something we need to be doing globally. So there are a number of questions, and I want to turn this over to Kara or Angela or Aurelia. There are a number of questions about where the slides will be available, etc. I do want to let folks know that we've posted both the ser.org/standards web link with a bunch of other information about the standards and the restoration ecology link. There will be more translations available soon. SER is also about to finalize our new version of our e-learning course, which is a on-demand course that you can take that goes through the standards and other components of restoration, and that will be available soon as well. I think within the next few weeks that's going to be up and available. But I highly recommend people to take a look at ser2021.org, which I forgot to put in the chat. But we're going to have lots and lots of opportunity for people to learn more about restoration, including 33 virtual field trips from around the world. So check it out. And Kara or Angela, if you could talk about how people can access this stuff afterwards.
So this video will be shared on the CEM website. In addition, you can download the standards from the SCR website, and I put a link there. There were a few private chats to me asking for the wetland meta-analysis that showed the response ratio. I'd be happy to share that with you if you email me. My email is down at the bottom of the page. I want to thank, again, all of you for participating in this 4th CEM dialogue. I want to especially thank my collaborators here from the Society for Ecological Restoration, Bethany and Jim. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us. And, you know, this is called a dialogue, but of course we're in Zoom format. And so, you know, we had a chance to answer some questions, but all of these topics are so important. We'd love to continue the conversation. Please do get in touch with any of us. And, you know, we'd be happy to listen and share perspectives. Thanks so much.
And thanks for inviting us too. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, really.
Have a great rest of your day or evening, depending on where you live. Bye-bye.